I came home that night feeling drained, the kind of exhaustion that settled deep into my bones, the kind that couldn't be fixed with just a good night's sleep or a quiet evening to myself. The office had been chaos. My boss had been breathing down my neck over deadlines that weren't even mine to begin with, and the only thing I wanted was to sit down, take off my shoes, and just exist in silence for a little while. But the second I stepped through the front door, I knew that wasn't going to happen, because the house was alive with noise. The sound of the television blaring some reality show my mother loved, my younger brother shouting into his headset as he lost yet another online match, and the unmistakable clatter of dishes in the sink. Dishes that, as usual, nobody but me would bother to wash. I sighed, setting my purse down, already bracing myself for whatever new demand was about to be thrown my way, because that was how it always went. They never greeted me with, "How was your day?" or "You look exhausted, do you need anything?" No, it was always, "Oh, good, you're home. I need you to take care of this." Right on cue, my mother appeared in the hallway, dressed in the brand new outfit I hadn't seen before, wearing a fresh manicure that definitely hadn't come cheap, her eyes lighting up the second she saw me. Not with warmth, not with any real affection, but with that same expectant look she always had whenever she needed something from me. "Natalie," she said, drawing out my name like she was talking to a child who had forgotten their chores. "I need you to send me money for groceries." I just stared at her for a moment, my brain lagging like a computer struggling to process too much information at once, because I had literally just sent her money last week, and not just a little, enough to cover everything she had said she needed plus extra just in case. I shifted my weight, exhaling slowly, trying to keep my frustration in check. "I already sent you money for groceries," I said, my voice carefully neutral, my hands tightening into fists at my sides. "Where did that go?" My mother waved a hand dismissively, already irritated by the fact that I dared to question her. "Well, I had other things to take care of," she said, like that was an answer. Like that justified why I was being asked to hand over even more of my paycheck when I hadn't even paid my own bills yet. Other things. I glanced down at the obviously new clothes, the freshly done nails, the luxury candle burning on the table that I knew for a fact cost more than I spent on an entire week of groceries for myself, and something inside me started to boil, slow and hot, like a pot about to overflow. "So you spent the grocery money on other things," I said, stating it as a fact rather than asking, because that's exactly what had happened. She scoffed, crossing her arms, her eyes narrowing like I was the unreasonable one here, like I was being difficult just for pointing out the truth. "Don't start, Natalie," she said, her tone sharp and impatient. "You know we rely on you for these things. It's not like you can't afford it." And there it was. That was always the unspoken rule of this house, the thing they never said outright, but always made sure I understood. I made more money than them, therefore it was my responsibility to handle everything, to fix everything, to cover every bill, every emergency, every poor financial decision they made. My younger brother, still glued to his game, let out a loud groan as his character died on the screen. "Damn it," he muttered, slamming his controller down onto the table, before glancing over at me with the same entitled look our mother had, the same expectation in his expression, the same assumption that whatever—
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
problem he had was now mine to fix. "Oh, by the way," he said casually, like this was some minor inconvenience instead of something that would cost me another chunk of my paycheck, "the internet is being slow. You should call the company and tell them to upgrade the plan or something." I turned to him slowly, barely able to believe what I had just heard. The internet. He wanted me to upgrade the internet. The internet that I already paid for in full every single month. The internet he used all day, every day, to sit on his ass and play video games instead of contributing anything to the household. I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head, feeling something snap deep inside me, something that had been held together for too long, something that couldn't be ignored anymore. "You know what?" I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended, but not caring enough to soften it. "You two are unbelievable. I pay for everything in this house: rent, utilities, groceries, internet, your Netflix, your emergencies, everything, and all you ever do is act like I owe it to you. My mother rolled her eyes, already annoyed with my attitude, already dismissing me before I could even finish. "Oh, here we go," she said, throwing her hands up dramatically. "You always have to act like a martyr. No one told you to do any of that. If you're so unhappy here, why don't you just leave?" The words hit me like a slap, not because they hurt, but because they were exactly what I needed to hear. Because she was right. Nobody was forcing me to stay. Nobody was holding me hostage. Nobody was making me give them my money month after month while getting nothing in return except exhaustion, resentment, and the overwhelming feeling that I was drowning in a life I didn't even want anymore. I stared at her, my expression unreadable, my body completely still, the weight of her words sinking in, settling into the cracks that had already been forming for years. Then I nodded, once slow and deliberate. "Okay," I said simply, my voice calm, final. "I will." My mother blinked, clearly not expecting that answer, clearly thrown off by how easy it had been for me to say, clearly realizing, far too late, that she might have just made the biggest mistake of her life. But by the time she opened her mouth to speak again, to backtrack, to try and take it back, I was already walking away. I had made my decision. And nothing, not her guilt, not her demands, not her empty, selfish excuses, was going to change it. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. I didn't sit there debating whether I was making the right choice, didn't spend the night agonizing over what would happen next, didn't allow myself even a second of doubt. The moment I walked away from that argument, from their ungrateful, entitled, self-serving mindset, I knew, without a single shred of uncertainty, that I was done. Not just tired, not just annoyed, not just frustrated.
Done.
Done being the one who always carried the weight. Done being the only responsible adult in a house full of people who refused to grow up. Done being treated like an endless supply of cash instead of a human being with my own needs, my own limits, my own goddamn life. I waited until the house was quiet, until my mother had retreated to her room, probably scrolling through her phone, already having forgotten about our conversation, already assuming I would just cool off and get over it like I always did. My brother had settled back into his usual evening routine, which involved doing absolutely nothing of value. Locked in his room, headset on, shouting at strangers online while he sat there using the internet I paid for, in a house I kept running, under a roof that would crumble without me. I moved through the house on autopilot, my hands methodical, my breathing steady, my movements precise and controlled, as if I had been planning this for years instead of mere hours. I took only what was mine, only what I had worked for, paid for, earned with my own two hands, leaving behind everything else because I knew that no matter how much they had drained me, no matter how much they had taken without so much as a thank you, they would always believe I owed them more. I packed quietly, carefully, efficiently, stuffing my suitcase with my clothes, my laptop, the few sentimental things that actually mattered to me, leaving behind anything they might whine about, anything they might use to try and guilt me into coming back. I wasn't leaving in anger. I wasn't slamming doors or shouting final words or making a scene because that's what they expected, that's what they would have wanted, because then they could twist it, make me out to be the emotional, irrational one, the dramatic, overreacting, selfish daughter and sister who abandoned her family over a few harsh words. No, this was going to be clean, quiet, unapologetic. Before I left, I sat down with my phone, carefully disconnecting myself from them in every way possible, making sure that when they finally noticed I was gone, when they finally realized what they had lost, when they finally reached the point where they had no choice but to face the consequences of their own actions, they wouldn't be able to pull me back into their mess. I went into my banking app and canceled every single autopay bill linked to my account, cutting off the electricity, the water, the Wi-Fi, the phone plans, the streaming services, all of it. Every last thing they had come to rely on, every single bill they had assumed I would continue paying, every dollar that had kept their little world spinning. Then I changed my mailing address, forwarding everything important to my new apartment, ensuring that no more late notices, overdraft warnings, or unpaid utility bills would ever land in my hands again. And finally, The last step, the most freeing part of all, blocking their numbers. I went through my contacts one by one, deleting, unfollowing, unfriending, blocking, ensuring that when they finally figured out what was happening, when they felt the first real wave of panic, when they finally understood what it was like to be left on their own without a safety net, they would have no direct line to me, no way to guilt me, no way to manipulate me into fixing the mess they had made. And when I was done, I stood there for a long moment, staring at my phone, staring at my packed bag, staring at the front door, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, relief. Because this wasn't some impulsive decision, wasn't some rash, heat-of-the-moment choice I would regret later. This was necessary. This was survival. This was freedom. The next morning, just as the sun was rising, I grabbed my bag, stepped outside, and walked away without a word. No goodbyes. No final speeches. No last glances. Just a door quietly clicking shut behind me, sealing off a chapter of my life I would never reopen. And the best part? They didn't even notice. Not right away. Not within hours. Not even by the end of the day. They were so used to taking me for granted, so used to assuming I would always be there, always be available, always be their financial crutch, that my absence didn't immediately register as anything significant. My mother probably thought I had gone to stay at a friend's for a while, assuming I just needed time to cool off, assuming I would come crawling back like I always did. My brother? He was probably too busy screaming at his game to even register that I was gone, too preoccupied with his next match, his next snack, his next distraction, to stop and think about how his entire lifestyle had been funded by someone who was no longer there. They wouldn't realize what had happened until the bills came due, until the lights flickered off, until the waters stopped running, until the internet went dead. And by the time they finally figured it out, by the time they actually, truly felt the consequences of losing me, it would already be too late. For the first week after I left, my phone stayed eerily silent. Not a single call, not a single message, not a single desperate attempt from my mother to drag me back into their world of never-ending demands, constant entitlement, and complete disregard for how much they had taken from me over the years. And if I had ever needed proof that I had been nothing more than a financial safety net to them, nothing more than a walking, breathing paycheck, this was it. They weren't worried. They weren't wondering if I was okay, if I was safe, if I was settling into my new life without them. They assumed, just as they always had, that I would come crawling back the second I realized how much they supposedly needed me. They assumed that I would wake up, be overcome with guilt, and rush to fix everything like I always did. And so, in the beginning, they continued living exactly the same way they had before, spending money they didn't have, using utilities they couldn't afford, pretending as if nothing had changed, because in their minds, nothing had. But then, slowly, the cracks started forming. It began with the small inconveniences, the little things that didn't immediately scream emergency, but instead build up over time, creeping into their daily routine like an unstoppable force they didn't yet understand. The first signs of trouble came in bright red envelopes, urgent final notice stamps, calls from unknown numbers that went ignored, each warning them that the luxury of my financial support was over, that there was no longer a second income magically covering their recklessness, that the bills they had so easily ignored for years were now entirely their responsibility. The rent went unpaid for the first time in years, the amount due sitting in my mother's unopened inbox, gathering dust like a problem she expected someone else to solve. The first disconnection notice for the power arrived in the mail, crisp and clear, an official reminder that the world didn't stop functioning just because they chose to ignore reality. But still, they waited, still they lived in blissful denial, still they carried on, convinced that I would eventually snap out of whatever selfish little phase I was going through and fix everything like I always did. Then, on a particularly humid afternoon, the power cut out. Not a flicker. Not a quick outage that would resolve itself within minutes. A complete and total blackout. And that was when the panic truly set in. I imagined it perfectly. The exact moment my mother flipped the light switch in the kitchen and nothing happened. The exact moment my brother went to charge his phone and realized the outlets were dead. The exact moment reality finally crashed into them like a freight train, sharp and unforgiving, stripping away every last ounce of their arrogance. I could picture my mother standing in the hallway, arms crossed, her face twisted in confusion, muttering something about how there must be a mistake, as if the universe itself had somehow wronged her. I could see my brother fuming in frustration, pacing back and forth, unable to comprehend how the internet could just disappear, how his comfortable, lazy existence could be interrupted so abruptly. I knew exactly how long it would take before the first phone call came, and I knew exactly how satisfying it would be to watch them finally understand that I wasn't coming back to save them. It started exactly when I expected it to, right on schedule, as if I had predicted every single one of their reactions before they even had time to process what was happening. The first call came just hours after the power shut off, my phone vibrating relentlessly against my nightstand, my mother's name flashing across the screen in bright, desperate letters, as if she truly believed that after weeks of complete silence, after years of taking everything from me without a second thought, after calling me selfish for daring to walk away, I would suddenly pick up and rescue her from the disaster she had created. I let it ring. She called again, and then again, and then again, each attempt more frantic than the last, each unanswered call an undeniable confirmation that I was no longer at her beck and call, no longer available to bail them out whenever they screwed up, no longer willing to sacrifice my own life for people who had never once considered how much they had drained me. Then came the first text, carefully worded, carefully crafted, the kind of manipulative nonsense I had seen from her before, but had never fully recognized for what it was until now. "Sweetheart, we miss you. Let's talk." It was laughable, really, how transparent it was, how fake the sudden warmth felt, how easily she flipped the switch from dismissive and condescending to loving and concerned now that she actually needed something from me. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of how cruel they had been, no sign that she had genuinely thought about why I left or how they had treated me. Just a desperate attempt to reel me back in. I didn't respond. Then came the text from my brother, and unlike my mother's pathetic, half-baked attempt at emotional manipulation, his messages were exactly as entitled, selfish, and ungrateful as I had always expected them to be. "What the hell, Natalie? The internet is off, the lights won't turn on, and Mom is freaking out. This is your fault." That was his first message, and if I had even the slightest doubt that leaving had been the best decision of my life, reading that sentence would have erased it instantly. His second message came minutes later, angrier, more demanding, dripping with the same entitlement that had been force-fed into him since childhood. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to fix this now." And finally, his last message, sent nearly an hour later, when I still hadn't responded, when he had finally begun to realize that I wasn't going to. "You're so **ing selfish. You're actually going to let your own family live like this? After everything we've done for you?" Everything they had done for me. I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it, at the absolute delusion it took for him to even type out those words, at the idea that he had convinced himself they had done anything for me at all. I closed out of my messages, silenced my phone, and leaned back against my couch, listening to the silence of my new apartment, the absence of their voices, their noise, their never-ending demands feeling like the deepest breath of fresh air I had ever taken. They had spent years ignoring me until they needed something from me. Now it was my turn to ignore them. It took longer than I expected, longer than I thought it would for them to finally understand, to fully grasp the reality of what had happened, to realize that I was actually gone, not just for a few days, not just for a temporary break, but permanently, completely, without any intention of ever coming back. At first, they had tried to pretend that nothing had changed, that my absence was just a phase, a tantrum, something they could wait out, something that would eventually correct itself when I finally came to my senses and did what they had always expected me to do. But now, weeks had passed, and I had not come back. The bills had gone unpaid, the utilities had been shut off, the refrigerator had gone warm, the internet had gone dead, and the foundation of their comfortable, entitled lives had crumbled beneath them in ways they had never once imagined possible. The first voicemail came late at night, my mother's voice sounding shaky, raw, on the edge of something she couldn't control, a kind of desperation I had never heard from her before. "Natalie, please, sweetheart, I know you're mad, I know you're upset, but we need to talk. I didn't realize how bad things would get without you. I didn't think. I just please call me back. We're in trouble. I listened to the message twice, sitting in the quiet of my new apartment, watching the city lights flicker outside my window, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no satisfaction, no thrill of revenge, no vindictive joy in hearing the sheer panic in her voice. Just emptiness. Because this wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about the bills, or the groceries, or the rent, or the dozens of other responsibilities they had dumped on me without a second thought. This was about all the years they had spent treating me like a resource instead of a person, all the times they had taken and taken and taken without ever once considering how much it was costing me to give. This was about the exhaustion, the resentment, the overwhelming feeling of being suffocated in a house where I was never truly wanted, only tolerated as long as I was useful. I didn't respond. The next voicemail came the following day, this time less desperate, more angry, more accusatory, as if the shift from begging to blaming was the only way my mother could process what was happening. You can't actually think this is fair, Natalie. We're your family. Family takes care of each other. Family doesn't just walk away and leave people to suffer. I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't right. This isn't what good daughters do. I smiled, shaking my head at the sheer hypocrisy dripping from every single word. Good daughters. Good daughters, in her mind, were the ones who sacrificed everything for their families without question, who gave until there was nothing left, who never complained, never asked for anything in return, never expected gratitude or respect or even the smallest ounce of kindness. Good daughters were expected to bleed themselves dry just to make sure everyone else stayed comfortable. I deleted the voicemail without a second thought. Then, as if the floodgates had truly burst open, my brother took to social media, airing his pathetic, whiny grievances for the world to see, painting himself as the victim, twisting the story until he looked like the abandoned child and I looked like the evil, heartless villain who had ruined everything for no reason. Imagine your own sister leaving you to suffer just because she wanted to be selfish. Imagine the person who was supposed to be there for you just cutting you off without warning. Some people are truly disgusting. The comments under his post were exactly what I expected, his equally entitled friends chiming in with fake sympathy, throwing around phrases like, family should always stick together, and money changes people, all of them blindly swallowing his version of events without ever stopping to wonder why I had left in the first place. I scrolled through them, shaking my head, marveling at how easy it was for him to twist the narrative, to make it sound like he was just some helpless, innocent sibling who had been cruelly abandoned, instead of a grown man who had spent years living off me like a parasite. The final blow came a few days later, when my mother left the voicemail that would have once shattered me, broken me, forced me to reconsider everything. Natalie, the landlord is threatening to evict us. We can't keep up with the payments. I don't know what to do. Please, baby, just call me. I'm begging you. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the weight of those words, the panic in her voice, the way she had finally realized that I was never coming back to save them. And then, as I sat there, remembering every single time she had made me feel like I wasn't enough, like I was selfish for wanting my own life, like my only purpose in that house had been to serve them, I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and pressed delete. I had grown accustomed to the deafening silence of my phone, a silence that for weeks had been punctuated only by the incessant ringing of notifications from family members who were too stubborn or too self-absorbed to realize that I was no longer their lifeline. And so when, on a particularly chilly morning, I finally saw a new voicemail from my mother, a voicemail that was different from all the frantic, desperate pleas I had heard before, I knew that this time something was about to change in a way that none of us could have foreseen, and as I pressed play, my heart pounded not with anticipation for reconciliation but with a cold, measured curiosity that had been honed over years of watching them take me for granted, and in that final, trembling message, her voice came through, shaking and raw, whispering, "We're sorry. We messed up. We need you." Words that felt simultaneously crushing and oddly empowering, as if they were the culmination of every single moment of neglect, every single instance of being treated like an expendable resource, and though a part of me had longed for even a flicker of remorse from the people who had drained me both emotionally and financially, I refused to let their sudden, contrived apology soften the hard-edged resolve that had taken root in me after so many years of being used without ever being truly valued. I sat there, the voicemail playing over and over again, each repetition echoing in the empty spaces of my new apartment where I had finally built a life free from their suffocating demands, and every time I heard her voice crack with defeat and desperation, I felt a surge of bitter satisfaction mingled with a profound sadness that all of this could have been avoided if only they had ever seen me as a person rather than a never-ending source of support. And when the message ended, I remained silent for a long, heavy moment, allowing the raw, unfiltered truth of what she had said to sink into the recesses of my mind before I finally, almost reluctantly, decided to answer the call, not with tears or anger, but with a steady, unwavering calm that spoke louder than any outburst ever could. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen as I prepared myself for the inevitable flood of questions and accusations that would follow, but as soon as I answered, I could immediately sense the exhaustion in my mother's voice, the kind of weary, defeated tone that comes from someone who has tried so hard for so long and has finally reached the end of their rope. And before I could even utter a greeting, she began, "Natalie, please, we're sorry. We really are. I know we've done so much wrong, and I don't know what else to say except that we need you now, more than ever." Her voice wavered with a mixture of regret and despair, and in that moment, I realized that all of those years of being called selfish and ungrateful, all of the times I had been expected to pour my hard-earned money into keeping their lives afloat, had finally led to this desperate plea that echoed in the quiet of my new world, a world where I had learned to value my own time, my own peace, my own existence above the endless demands of a family that had never truly appreciated me. I paused, my breath coming out slowly as I gathered my thoughts, and with a voice that was both calm and cuttingly direct, I finally said, "Oh, so now you need me?" The words slipped out effortlessly, each syllable a deliberate punctuation to the silence that followed, and as I spoke, I could almost hear the shock and disbelief on the other end of the line, as if my simple, unadorned question had shattered all the carefully constructed illusions they had built around their relationship with me, and in that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. My decision to leave had irrevocably altered the dynamics of our family, and while I had long ago accepted that I would never be their savior or their fallback, the raw sincerity in my mother's voice, combined with the futility of her repeated pleas, made it clear that they were finally beginning to understand the magnitude of the loss they had inflicted upon themselves by taking me for granted. For a long, interminable minute, I said nothing, letting the silence stretch out between us like the vast, empty spaces of a desert where nothing grew, where no amount of water or warmth could ever bring life back, and all I could think about were the countless times I had sacrificed my own happiness and well-being to make sure theirs was secured, the endless stream of money, time, and energy I had poured into a family that never once acknowledged the value of my contributions, and in that quiet pause I felt no remorse, no guilt, only the steadfast determination that every single moment of neglect, every instance of being demeaned, had led me to this final juncture where I no longer needed to carry the burdens of their expectations. Finally, with a voice that held no trace of regret but was instead laced with a cold, unyielding finality, I said, "I'm not coming back, and you will have to live with the consequences of your choices." And then I hung up, leaving my mother's desperate plea to echo unanswered in the void of my newfound freedom, a freedom that was both exhilarating and sorrowful, a freedom that promised no reconciliation and no second chances, but instead offered the pure, unfiltered clarity of a life lived on my own terms. That call, that single, life-altering moment, marked the point of no return, the definitive moment when I severed the last remaining ties that had bound me to a world of unending obligation and familial abuse, and as I sat there in the stillness of my apartment, a quiet smile playing on my lips as I stared at the darkened screen, I knew that while they might still desperately cling to the remnants of a family that had never truly appreciated them, I had finally found a way to reclaim my own life, and in doing so, I had set in motion a chain of events that would change everything, not just for them but for me as well, in ways that were as unpredictable as they were inevitable, leaving behind a legacy of choices made for the sake of self-respect, for the sake of dignity, for the sake of never again being reduced to nothing more than a walking, talking ATM, and that, in the end, was the only power I needed to truly say that nothing would ever be the same again. The moment I hung up the phone, I knew the call wasn't over, knew without a doubt that my mother wouldn't accept my silence as an answer, that she wouldn't let my refusal stand without making at least one last desperate attempt to drag me back into the cycle I had finally escaped. And sure enough, not even 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed again, her name flashing across the screen, a relentless demand for attention, a final, frantic grasp at control she no longer had. I let it ring twice, my finger hovering over the screen, not out of hesitation, not out of guilt, but because I wanted her to feel the weight of every unanswered call, the same way I had felt the weight of every single time I had begged for recognition, for appreciation, for even the smallest acknowledgement of how much I had given. When I finally picked up, I didn't say anything at first, just let the silence stretch between us, let her sit in it, let her be the one to break it first, and when she did, her voice was raw with panic, cracking under the pressure of everything she had spent years ignoring. "Natalie, please, you can't just do this," she said, her words tumbling over each other, her breath coming in uneven gasps as if she had just run a marathon, as if the sheer shock of consequences finally catching up to her was physically exhausting. "We have nothing left. The landlord is threatening to kick us out, we can't pay the water bill, and I don't understand how you could do this to us." I almost laughed at the sheer absurdity of it, at the way she had twisted the entire situation to make it sound as if I had done something to them, as if I had stolen something that had belonged to them, as if my absence was an active attack rather than a long-overdue boundary finally being enforced. "You don't understand how I could do this?" I repeated, my voice steady, unnervingly calm, and I could almost hear the way she flinched on the other end of the line, because she knew that tone, knew it meant she was about to hear something she wasn't ready to face. "I'll tell you exactly how." And then, for the first time in my life, I laid it all out. I reminded her of the years of sacrifice, the endless financial burdens I had shouldered without complaint, the nights I had stayed up worrying about how I was going to cover bills that weren't even mine, the times I had gone without just to make sure they had everything they wanted. I reminded her of the vacations she had taken while I was stuck at work, the shopping sprees she had justified as self-care while I stretched my paycheck to make sure rent was paid on time, the way my brother had lived off me without shame, without remorse, without even the slightest inclination to contribute in any meaningful way. I reminded her of every single time she had called me selfish for daring to say no, for daring to suggest that I deserved more than being treated like an ATM, for daring to believe that my own needs mattered just as much as theirs. And when I was done, when I had said everything that had been building inside me for years, when there was nothing left but the heavy, unbearable weight of truth pressing down on her, I let the silence settle between us again, waiting for her to say something, to finally admit that she had been wrong, that she had taken advantage of me, that she had never once appreciated what I had done. But instead, she did what she had always done, she begged. "Natalie, I hear you, I do, I swear," she said, her voice breaking, a tremble of emotion shaking through each word, but I had heard that tone before, had seen her turn on the tears like a faucet whenever she needed something, had spent years watching her manipulate every situation until she got exactly what she wanted. "But we're your family. You can't just turn your back on us over money. It's not fair." Fair. The word felt so ridiculous, so completely detached from reality, so hypocritical coming from the very person who had spent my entire life making sure nothing was ever fair for me. And just as I opened my mouth to respond, my brother's voice cut in from the background, sharp, furious, drenched in the same entitlement that had been beaten into him since childhood. "She's just being a selfish B***tisic mom," he sneered, his voice muffled through the speaker, but still dripping with venom, with unchecked rage. with the sheer audacity of someone who had spent his entire life believing that the world owed him something. She thinks she's better than us now. She thinks just because she has money, she doesn't have to care about her own family anymore. Let her go, see how long she lasts without us. I closed my eyes for a long moment, exhaling slowly, because even though I had expected this, even though I had known he would lash out the second he realized he had no power over me anymore, hearing it still sent a bitter, searing frustration through me, because if there had ever been a moment where he could have chosen to be better, this had been it, and he had failed spectacularly. And that was when I knew, without a doubt, that I had made the right decision. I shook my head, laughing softly, not out of amusement but out of sheer disbelief, because they still didn't get it, still didn't understand, still couldn't comprehend that this wasn't about revenge, wasn't about proving a point, wasn't about punishing them. It was about finally, for the first time in my life, choosing myself over them. "You told me you didn't need me," I said, my voice quiet but cutting, each word laced with a finality that sent a shiver of realization through the silence that followed. "Now you know what that really means." My mother sucked in a breath, and for the first time, I thought I heard it. The moment of realization, the flicker of understanding, the slow, dawning truth that I wasn't coming back, that there was nothing left to take, that I had finally closed the door they had never expected me to walk away from. I didn't wait for her to respond, didn't give her the chance to argue, didn't let her try to twist my words into something they weren't. I hung up the phone, and this time, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never answer it again. For the first time in years, I woke up without the weight of someone else's problems pressing down on my chest, without the endless to-do lists running through my mind, without the constant fear that if I didn't handle everything, the world around me would collapse. The air in my apartment felt different, lighter, as if the very walls had absorbed the truth of my newfound freedom, as if the space itself had been waiting for me to finally understand that I was allowed to exist for myself, that my purpose was not to carry other people's burdens while they sat back and watched me drown. I stretched my legs over the edge of my bed, letting the morning sun spill through the blinds, warming my skin, the silence around me a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind. No yelling, no demands, no voices calling my name with yet another request, yet another expectation, yet another reminder that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. Somewhere, back in that house, my mother was probably standing in the kitchen, staring at another overdue notice, another final warning, another undeniable sign that the safety net she had relied on for so long was gone. I could picture her pacing, her hands gripping the phone, trying to come up with another excuse, another manipulation, another way to drag me back into the mess she had created. But this time, she had nothing left to hold over me, no more guilt to weaponize, no more control to exert. And my brother, he was likely still glued to his phone, scrolling through social media, complaining to his friends about how selfish I was, how cruel it was that I had abandoned them, how unbelievable it was that I had the audacity to put myself first for once. I imagined him typing out some angry post, some self-pitying rant about how family should always stick together, how money changes people, how I had forgotten where I came from, as if he had ever done a single thing to deserve my help, as if he had ever lifted a finger to support me the way I had spent my entire life supporting them. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel cruel. I didn't feel anything but free. I stood up slowly, stretching my arms, my body still adjusting to what it felt like to wake up, without stress gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, without the knowledge that at any moment someone would come knocking, asking for more, demanding what they thought was rightfully theirs. I padded into the kitchen, the hardwood cool beneath my feet, and grabbed a glass from the cabinet, pouring myself a drink, not because I needed to celebrate, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I could, because this moment was mine alone, because no one was here to tell me otherwise. I took a slow sip, savoring the quiet, savoring the absence of expectation, savoring the knowledge that I had finally walked away from people who had never seen me as more than a means to an end. I thought about my mother's last voicemail, the one I had deleted without hesitation, the one where she had finally broken, finally admitted that she had messed up, that she had needed me, but not once, Not in any of her desperate calls. Had she ever said I'm sorry? Had she ever admitted to the years of manipulation? To the years of making me feel like I was only worth what I could provide? To the years of telling me I was selfish for even considering wanting something for myself? No, all she had wanted was to fix the problem she had created, to smooth things over just enough so that I would come back, just enough so that she could keep using me, just enough so that she could pretend for a little while longer that nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and I wasn't going back. I walked toward the window, the city stretching out before me, the skyline glowing under the early morning sun, and I let myself breathe in the truth of my new reality. I had spent so many years believing that family was something unbreakable, something unconditional, something that required sacrifice without question. But now, standing here, standing in the life I had built for myself, I understood the truth. Family is only worth holding on to when they hold on to you, too. I had given and given and given, and they had taken and taken and taken, and the moment I had finally said no, they had called me selfish, as if my only worth had ever been in what I could do for them. But now, they had no choice but to face what they had done, to sit in the consequences of their own actions, to live in the mess they had created without expecting me to clean it up for them. I lifted my glass, tilting it slightly in the direction of the horizon, a quiet, personal toast to the version of myself that had finally learned to walk away, to the version of myself that no longer felt obligated to fix what she didn't break, to the version of myself that had chosen peace over obligation, freedom over guilt, self-respect over servitude. The best decision I ever made? I murmured to no one but myself, my voice steady, certain, unshaken. Walking away.